They called him Mr. D, not because they couldn't pronounce Davis, but because somehow Mr. Davis felt too distant, too formal for someone who had quietly become the heart of the school. Harold Davis had been walking those halls longer than most teachers had been teaching, 30 years, to be exact. He had keys to every room, knew every corner of every hallway, and had fixed things most people never even knew were broken. The lights that flickered, he changed the bulbs before anyone noticed. The toilets that clogged, he had them flushing before the principal even got the maintenance request. But Harold didn't just clean the building. He cared for it, like it was a living thing, like it breathed, just like the children who rushed through it every day. And in many ways, it did. Harold wasn't a man of many words. He never boasted, never needed to be thanked. He showed up every morning before sunrise, unlocking doors while the fog still curled against the grass. Sometimes you'd find him in the cafeteria, brewing coffee before the kitchen crew even arrived. Other times, you'd catch him outside, picking up litter along the fence line with a quiet determination, humming old soul songs under his breath. He was the first to arrive, the last to leave, and the one no one seemed to notice until they needed him. To the students, he was a silent guardian. Some thought he had eyes in the back of his head. He always seemed to know when a kid was sneaking into class late or needed a moment to cry in the stairwell. And when they did, he didn't say much. Maybe just a soft, "You all right?" or a silent pat on the shoulder. But somehow, that always felt like enough. Teachers whispered about how Harold had been around so long. He'd probably seen 3 generations pass through those lockers. And it was true. Some of the kids he helped tie shoes for in the 90s were now parents, sending their own children into his care without even realizing it. There was a certain reverence about Harold. He wasn't a loud man. He didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, shoulders back, chin up, that soft but purposeful stride. Maybe it was the way he cleaned the floor like it was sacred ground, sweeping with slow, deliberate strokes, as if trying to erase not just dirt, but the chaos of the world outside. In a town like theirs, small, southern, and too often still stuck in the past, Harold was the thread that stitched the school together. Not everyone saw it, but the ones who mattered did. Some students used to call him the key wizard. His belt jingled with what felt like 100 keys, each one unlocking a part of the school's soul. But those keys weren't just metal and teeth, they were trust. The trust that the science teacher's lab would be ready by morning, that the auditorium lights would work on the night of the school play, that the bathroom would be clean before anyone had to complain. Harold held the place together, literally and metaphorically, and he did it all without a single demand for recognition. But even more than the school, Harold held space for the students who fell between the cracks, the ones who were too angry to ask for help, the ones whose backpacks were too empty, whose shoes were too warm, whose eyes told stories that no teacher had time to read. He saw them. He didn't push. He didn't pry. He just noticed. And in a world where noticing was rare, that was everything. There was a young boy once, Marcus, who had just lost his father and couldn't bring himself to speak for weeks. Teachers worried. Counselors tried. But it was Harold who found him curled up behind the gym one afternoon, arms wrapped tight around his knees. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't try to fix it. He just sat beside him, quiet, steady. And every day after that, Marcus made sure to wave at Mr. D in the hallway. Years later, when Marcus graduated with honors, he handed Harold a handwritten letter. It simply said, "You saved me," without saying a word. Harold kept that letter in his shirt pocket for years, folded and faded, but never forgotten. Because while the world might have labeled him a janitor, those who knew him understood he was something much more. A quiet healer, a walking history, a living, breathing monument to patience and kindness. Still, despite the decades of loyalty and love, Harold had never once been invited to a staff meeting, never had his name etched on a plaque, never been asked to speak at graduation. To some, he was just a man who mopped floors. To others, he was the reason those floors felt like home. He never complained, never once asked for more. But the truth was he deserved more, so much more. His uniform was always crisp, his shoes always clean, his eyes tired but clear. And yet, behind the routine and the humble nods was a man who had watched time change the school and the country around him. He had seen segregation dissolve, only to watch new forms of exclusion take its place. He had watched black students rise and fall. He had wiped their blood from the floors after hallway fights. He had swept up broken pencils, broken dreams. And still, Every morning, he showed up, unshaken, unseen, but undeniably vital. In a building filled with lesson plans and rules, it was Harold Davis who taught the greatest lesson of all, not through words, but through presence. A lesson about grace, about showing up, even when the world doesn't see you, about dignity that doesn't need a podium. And yet, as steady as he had been, as loved as he was by many, there would come a day when the world reminded Harold that no matter how many keys you hold, some doors still slam in your face. And that day was coming. It started with a phone call. Just one call. One neighbor. One assumption. That's all it took to turn 30 years of quiet service into a scene of suspicion. Harold Davis had cleaned at school longer than some of the parents had been alive, but all it took was one person who didn't recognize his face, or worse, pretended not to. That morning, Harold was doing what he always did, taking care of the school before the world woke up. He'd arrived early, before the sun had broken over the pine trees that lined the back parking lot. The air was still, the kind of hush that made even the birds take their time waking up. He unlocked the supply closet, grabbed his cart, and began his routine, checking the bathrooms near the gym, refilling hand soap, making sure the sinks weren't leaking again. He worked in silence, like always, but outside the building, someone was watching him. Not a teacher, not a student, just a neighbor, someone who lived across the street, someone who didn't know Harold, or maybe worse, someone who knew exactly who he was, and didn't think that mattered. The police dispatcher's voice was calm when she logged the call. Suspicious man on school property, possibly attempting to break in. The officer who took the dispatch was new to the department, young, eager, and scared in the way that gets dangerous when a badge and gun are involved. Within minutes, 2 cruisers pulled up to the school, lights flashing silently in the early morning fog. They didn't knock. They didn't ask questions. They entered the school through the side door, guns drawn. Harold was in the hallway near the auditorium, wiping down a vending machine that had been smudged with fingerprints. He didn't hear them at first, not until the sharp yell cut through the stillness. Hands up. Turn around. Don't move. Harold turned, confused. For a second, he thought it was a joke. One of those fake drills the school sometimes ran without warning. But then he saw the guns, the faces, the fear in their eyes. And in that instant, something broke inside him. Something he didn't even know could break. I work here, Harold said softly, instinctively raising his hands. I've worked here for 30 years. But his voice, calm, low, withered with age, was met with more shouting. Down on your knees. He obeyed, not because he was guilty, not because he was afraid of running, but because he'd seen what happened to black men who tried to explain, who tried to reason, who tried to survive while being misunderstood. He'd seen it on the news, on his phone, in his neighborhood, and now it was his turn. They cuffed him on the cold tile floor, right there in the hallway, where he had once knelt to clean up a student's vomit without complaint. One of the officers pressed a knee into his back. Another held his arms, the same arms that had changed ceiling tiles, pushed heavy carts, opened jammed lockers, now twisted behind him like he was a threat to the very building he had protected. The principal arrived minutes later, shocked, frantic, apologetic. That's Mr. Davis, she shouted, rushing toward the scene. He's our custodian. He's worked here for decades. The officers froze, realization slowly creeping into their expressions. But the damage had been done. The cuffs had been locked. The knee had been pressed. The humiliation had unfolded like a stain spreading across polished tile. They uncuffed Harold. No apology. Just silence. That awkward, suffocating kind of silence that tries to erase what just happened but can't. The principal tried to make light of it, tried to laugh it off. Must have been a misunderstanding, she said, nervously glancing at the officers, hoping Harold would just let it go. But he didn't laugh. He stood up slowly, his back aching, his pride bruised in a way no mop or a broom could ever fix. He looked around the hallway he had cleaned every day for 30 years, and it no longer felt like home. It felt foreign, like a place that could turn on him at any moment. And that broke him in ways few people ever saw. Word spread quickly through the school. Teachers whispered behind closed doors. Students stared when he passed. Some offered quiet, embarrassed smiles, unsure of what to say. Others avoided his gaze altogether, ashamed or unsure how to process the image of the man with all the keys, on his knees in handcuffs. And the worst part, there was no real consequence. No reprimand for the officers. No press release. No email to the staff. Just silence. As if Harold's humiliation was an acceptable mistake, a small price to pay for someone else's comfort. But Harold couldn't unfeel what had happened, couldn't unhear the shouting, couldn't unsee the way the officers had looked at him, as if he didn't belong, as if 3 decades of service had meant nothing in the face of one assumption. He went home early that day, the first time in years, didn't say much, didn't slam doors or raise his voice. He just sat in his recliner, stared at the wall, and wondered what it would take for the world to see him not just as a black man in a uniform, but as a man who mattered. Because Harold Davis didn't just clean the school, he was the school. And yet, in one moment, all it took was a stranger's voice and a blind assumption to strip that all away. That call should have never been made, but it was. And nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, Harold moved differently through the halls of Fairview Elementary. He still showed up early, still unlocked the same doors, still polished the same floors. But the warmth that used to follow him, those familiar nods from teachers, the waves from kids who remembered him fixing their jammed lockers or offering them tissues after playground tears, that warmth had faded. Not because people stopped caring, but because they didn't know how to confront what had happened. And some didn't want to. Harold noticed everything. The way conversations paused when he walked into a room. The way no one mentioned the incident out loud, as if silence could erase the image of him face down in his own hallway. He overheard someone call it an unfortunate mistake. He bit down hard on his tongue to keep from asking, whose mistake? Because he knew it wasn't his. And yet, he was the one who felt marked. Every room he entered, he didn't just see what needed cleaning. He saw the memory of where it happened. The supply closet near the auditorium, where they had yelled for him to freeze. The vending machine he was wiping down when their guns were drawn. The cold tiles where he had knelt, humiliated. He started spending his lunch breaks outside. Not to eat. He rarely had an appetite anymore, but to breathe, to feel the wind against his skin, to remind himself that he was still here, still human. Sometimes he'd sit on a bench behind the gym, watching the birds flicker between the trees, trying to quiet the rage building inside him. Not just rage for himself, but for every black man who had been mistaken for a threat while simply existing. One afternoon, a 5th-grade teacher named Ms. Rodriguez approached him outside. She had always been kind to Harold, the kind of teacher who remembered birthdays, who stayed after class to help struggling kids, who brought extra gloves in the winter to hand out quietly to students who needed them. But even she didn't quite know what to say. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice soft, broken with guilt. I'm so sorry, Mr. Davis. That never should have happened to you." Harold nodded slowly. He appreciated the honesty, the courage it took to speak when everyone else chose silence. "Thank you," he said, then paused. "You're the first to say that out loud." That night, Harold sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the one thing that had always brought him peace, his late wife's picture. Bernice had passed 5 years earlier, cancer taking her faster than he could understand. She used to say, "Baby, you hold the school together more than anyone else there. They might not see it, but I do." And now he wondered how many others never truly saw him. That question wouldn't leave him alone. So he made a decision. The next morning, Harold walked into the principal's office, not as the janitor, but as a man reclaiming his dignity. Principal Ellis looked up, startled by his presence. "Mr. Davis," she began, nervously standing, "I'm so sorry about everything that happened. I was shocked. I had no idea the officers would respond like that. I thought it was just a misunderstanding." "I need to speak at the next school board meeting," Harold said, his voice calm but firm. She blinked. "Speak. I've given 30 years to this school. It's time they hear my story." For a moment, Principal Ellis looked unsure, torn between bureaucracy and human decency. But something in Harold's eyes told her this wasn't a request. It was a reckoning. The school board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Word spread quickly. Some staff whispered about it nervously. Others offered him quiet encouragement. But Harold wasn't doing it for them. He was doing it for every time he'd been overlooked. Every time his service had been reduced to the janitor. Every time someone clutched their purse or crossed the street or called the police, simply because of his skin. When the night came, the boardroom was packed. Teachers, parents, even a few former students. Harold sat in the front row, hands folded neatly, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. When his name was called, he rose slowly, shoulders straight, back firm. No mop, no uniform, just Harold Davis, A man with 30 years of stories buried beneath silence. He walked to the microphone, paused, and looked across the crowd. "My name is Harold Davis," he began. "I've worked at Fairview Elementary for 30 years. I've opened the school in the dark and locked it down in the quiet. I've cleaned blood off nurses' office floors and gum off the bottom of desks. I've fixed leaking pipes, unclogged toilets, and caught rats in the basement without a complaint. I've watched children grow up here, watched them graduate and come back with kids of their own." He paused, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "But last week, someone called the police on me, said I looked suspicious. 2 officers stormed in with guns drawn, made me get on my knees in the very hallway I've spent most of my life cleaning. And no one stopped them. No one asked questions. No one gave me the benefit of the doubt, because to them, I wasn't Mr. Davis. I wasn't the man with the keys. I was just a black man in a building where someone decided I didn't belong." Silence settled like a weight across the room. Harold looked down for a moment, then back up. "I'm not here to accuse anyone. I'm here because we can't fix what we won't face. If I can spend 3 decades taking care of this school, then this school can take care of me. I'm asking for one thing: dignity, recognition, a chair at the table. I want my name to mean something." There was a long pause. Then, slowly, a few hands began to clap, then more, until the room erupted, not in pity, but in respect, in witness. That night, the board unanimously voted to honor Harold with a permanent plaque near the school entrance. A dedication, a chair and his name in the teacher's lounge. But more than that, they gave him voice. For the first time in 30 years, Harold Davis wasn't just a man who cleaned the school. He was the man who stood up for himself and demanded to be seen. And that, more than any job title, was his real legacy. They came back, older, wiser, carrying their own children on their hips or in their hearts. They came back with memories folded into the creases of their adulthood, like old notes stuffed in jacket pockets. These were Harold's kids, the ones who'd once rushed past him in hallways without really seeing him, only to realize years later that he had seen them the entire time. And now, when they saw the viral footage of him being handcuffed, humiliated, and treated like a criminal in the very halls where he had once polished trophies and hearts alike, they couldn't stay silent. One by one, they began to speak. It started with a simple Facebook post. A former student named Deshaun, now a civil rights attorney in Atlanta, shared the story with a caption that read, "He taught me what dignity looked like. Now we owe him ours." That post was shared over 100,000 times in a week. Then came Mariah, who remembered how Harold had found her crying in the stairwell after she failed her chemistry test. No teachers came, no friends noticed. But Harold did. He knelt down, slid a bag of sunflower seeds from his pocket, and just sat with her. He didn't say much, just enough to make her believe she wasn't invisible. She told that story on TikTok, her voice trembling. "He wasn't my janitor. He was my lifeline." From there, the floodgates burst. Videos, tweets, hashtags. Hashtag justice for Mr. Davis. Hashtag he belonged more than us. Hashtag the man with the keys. It wasn't just students. Former teachers, cafeteria workers, even rival basketball coaches who remembered Harold cheering from the sidelines with his old transistor radio hanging from his belt. They all spoke out. One video showed a montage of old yearbook photos. In nearly every one, there he was in the background, sweeping, smiling, holding the door. They had edited them together with Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" playing over it. The caption read, "Maybe we never gave him the mic, but we always heard his song." At the center of it all was Harold. He didn't ask for the spotlight. In fact, he seemed almost embarrassed by it. He'd always been the type to put his head down and do the work, not chase the credit. But now the world wanted to give it to him. And the kids, his kids, wouldn't let the moment pass. Local news turned into national coverage. CNN picked it up. So did NPR. The mayor's office issued a statement, followed by the school district, though both read more like damage control than remorse. Still, the fire had caught, and it couldn't be smothered with polished press releases. Then came the moment that changed everything. A group of former students, now parents, engineers, poets, and postal workers, organized a rally on the school's football field. They called it the assembly he never got. Harold tried to decline the invitation, said he didn't want to fuss, said there were more important people to honor, but they insisted, because for them, he was the most important person they'd ever known. The bleachers were packed. Local news helicopters buzzed overhead. A giant banner hung behind the podium. for the one who never asked for thanks. One by one, they spoke. A former gang member turned youth counselor told how Harold had once swept blood off the gym floor after a fight and told him, "You're better than the mess you're making." A science teacher broke down, remembering how Harold fixed her car every winter just so she could get to school safely. A now famous actor FaceTimed in from LA, recalling how Harold once told him, "You got a light in you. Don't let nobody shut it off." But the moment that broke everyone came when a woman stepped to the mic, holding a small urn. Her name was Tanya Rivers. Her son, Marcus, had died of leukemia in the 10th grade. "Mr. Harold," she said, her voice cracking, "cleaned Marcus' room every day in the hospital, even though he didn't have to. He told my baby, 'This ain't dirt. It's just life's footprints. We clean them so we can walk forward again.'" She held up the urn. "My son wanted you to have this." There wasn't a dry eye on the field. Harold, seated off to the side, stood up slowly. He walked over, hugged Tanya tight, and whispered something only she heard. She nodded, sobbing. He took the urn, held it to his chest, and looked out at the crowd. Then, for the first time in his life, Harold Davis stepped up to a microphone. His voice was quiet, hoarse, but it carried. "I spent 30 years picking up trash most folks never saw. Gum wrappers, crumpled love notes, torn up homework. But I also picked up dreams, you know? Yours. And when I saw a dream that looked like it was going to fall, I picked that up too." Silence. "I never needed a plaque or a podium. I just needed to know you all turned out okay. That's enough for me." Then, softly, almost to himself, he added, "But maybe I did belong after all." The crowd rose as one. Applause thundered like rain on a tin roof. It wasn't polite. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, unfiltered. It came from the hearts of every person who had once walked those school halls and failed to see the man holding them up. They saw him now, not as a janitor, not even as a hero, but as family. The next Monday morning, the school looked different, not physically, not in its bricks or paint, but in the way the light seemed to fall on it, as if it had been washed in the tears of a community finally seeing what it had overlooked. Inside those halls, once sterile with routine, a current of something unfamiliar stirred. Reflection, grief, pride, and beneath it all, the weight of a long overdue reckoning. At the very front office, beneath the wall of framed photos of retired principals and celebrated athletes, sat a chair. Not a fancy one, just a plain, wooden one. But this chair wasn't for sitting. On it lay a folded janitor's uniform, clean, pressed, and placed with reverence. Across the back, stitched in gold thread, the words, "Mr. Davis, 30 years of honor." Students passed it in silence. Some paused. Others snapped photos. A few placed sticky notes on it, little messages like, "Thank you, Mr. D," or "I see you now." It was a shrine made not of stained glass or stone, but of humility, memory, and respect. But that was just the beginning. Inside the school board chambers a few blocks away, a different kind of noise stirred. The kind made by lawyers, nervous officials, and policy directors suddenly realizing the ground had shifted under them. The district hadn't expected this story to catch fire the way it did. They thought a quiet apology would settle things. But what they'd underestimated, what they always underestimated, was the power of the people once considered invisible. A coalition of alumni, teachers, and students had drafted a petition, renamed the school auditorium after Harold Davis, not just as a tribute, but as a corrective act, a public acknowledgement of dignity denied for too long. The petition garnered over 500,000 signatures in a matter of days. Celebrities tweeted about it. Local businesses added their names. Even a state senator called the board out publicly, demanding transparency, accountability, and respect. At the next school board meeting, the line to enter wrapped around the block. Television vans crowded the street like sentinels of truth. Inside, the air pulsed with the weight of history being written. Harold didn't want to go. He said it was too much, too loud, too late. But his granddaughter, Lena, the one who used to draw hearts on his brown bag lunch before school, took his hand and said, "Papa, you gave your life to that building. Let them give something back." So he went. The auditorium was standing room only. He entered quietly, no fanfare, no applause. Just the hush that falls when someone sacred walks into the room. The board chair cleared her throat. "We are here today not to erase what was done, but to reckon with what was never recognized. Mr. Davis, please, would you join us on stage?" He didn't move at first, but Lena gently nudged him. He stood slowly and walked forward, his old boots still scuffed at the toes, his shoulders still square with quiet dignity. When he reached the podium, he didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the kids, the ones in hoodies and football jackets and worn-out backpacks, the ones who looked like he once did. He took a deep breath. I cleaned this school for 30 years. That's a long time to sweep up what people drop. Trash, yes, but also pieces of themselves. Anger, shame, hope. I found them all in those hallways. And I tried, Lord knows I tried, to treat every piece like it mattered. You could hear a pin drop, but I also spent those years being invisible. Folks walked past me like I was part of the mop, like I wasn't nothing but a shadow. Until one day, they made sure I felt it in handcuffs. He paused, swallowed hard. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for recognition, because there are a lot of us who go unseen every day. Folks who shine shoes, clean floors, take out your trash. We keep the world turning, but y'all only see us when it's time to blame someone. Then, looking directly at the school board, he added, but I am somebody. I always was. The room erupted. One by one, board members stood to cast their votes on the auditorium naming. 7 out of 7, unanimous. The Harold Davis Auditorium, etched in metal, carved in permanence, stamped on every school calendar, every graduation program, every visitor map for generations to come. But the reckoning didn't end there. The police department issued a rare public apology, citing the incident as a failure of protocol and human judgment. The arresting officer was placed on unpaid leave, pending review. But Harold didn't demand his firing. He said, "Why want is a world where he sees me first, as a man, before he sees me as a threat." More importantly, the school district announced mandatory racial bias and de-escalation training for all school resource officers. For the first time in its history, janitorial staff would be honored during the annual Employee Appreciation Week, and every student would now be required to learn local civil rights history, including the story of Harold Davis, not just as a lesson, as a legacy. At the renaming ceremony, Lena stood behind the new auditorium plaque, holding her grandfather's hand. The brass shimmered in the sunlight. Below his name were the words. He carried the keys to more than just doors. As they unveiled it, a group of children released white balloons into the sky. Each one bore a note inside, memories of Harold written by students past and present. They floated up, twisting in the wind like tiny souls returning to heaven. In that moment, it was clear. This was more than a name, more than a room, more than a story. It was justice, not the courtroom kind, but the human kind. The kind that says, we see you now, and we should have seen you all along. As Harold looked out at the crowd, a tear ran down his weathered cheek, not from sadness, but from a weight finally lifted, from decades of being unspoken finally turning into a chorus that roared, sang, wept, and healed. And in that auditorium, newly christened with his name, something sacred had happened. Not just a reckoning, but a resurrection. Sometimes, the most powerful voices are the ones we never bothered to hear. And sometimes, justice doesn't come from a courtroom, but from a community finally opening its eyes. Harold Davis didn't wear a badge or sit behind a desk. He didn't make speeches or pass laws, but he showed up every single day for 3 decades, quietly, humbly, unseen, until one day, they put handcuffs on the wrong man, and the world saw what it had ignored for far too long. This isn't just a story. It's the story of every invisible worker, every overlooked soul, every person whose worth isn't written on their paycheck, but on the lives they touch. So the next time you walk past someone like Harold, stop. Look. See. Because behind every set of keys, there just might be a legacy. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real heroes have been all along.